Start recording now. Welcome everybody. Steve Burns here from. Thank you for joining Digital Creativity with Stephen Burns. And today we are having the San Diego Photoshop Users Group meeting, of which I am the president. Welcome everybody, and we've got a good crowd online already, and I expect it to grow. I'm hoping I had over 120 people register on the Eventbrite, so we're hoping to get a really good crowd today. So if you guys know, send the URL to the Twitch site here, which is the www.twitch.tv/ChromaIllusion to your friends right now on Twitter and Facebook. Tell them to join in this great presentation with Dennis Dunbar. Dennis Dunbar, this guy is the real deal. You ever see the movie posters, some Star Wars or adventure movies? This is the guy that does that stuff, right? So he's got some incredible techniques, and I wanted this to be more of an advanced retouching type of a presentation. So I think what he's going to do is he's going to break it up into two sections. The first half is going to probably cover some more beginning level approaches to retouching, and the second half is going to be more advanced retouching techniques. So I think it's going to be a little bit of something here for everybody. So now just a couple of things I want to mention. Make sure you follow the Twitch site so that each time we come on for more user group meetings or presentations, you're going to be notified automatically. All right, so follow the page and make sure for the option you tell it to notify you whenever I'm on. That's going to be very helpful. And then you're going to see little links come up every once in a while. It's called Nightbot. Those are little advertising links. So things like join the SD Photoshop Users Group, definitely do that. Become a member. It's free. You'll be notified, and all that fun stuff. So how about this? Without further ado, let's go on and let me share with you Dennis Dunbar. You're looking at his website now. An incredible retoucher, artist, works quite a bit with Photoshop, and he's working in the commercial industry of taking Photoshop skill sets to a whole new level, which I'm happy to bring here to help share with you guys. So Dennis, thank you for being here so much. We greatly appreciate it. Take it away, man.
Happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me. So I thought I'd start off with just a little bit about myself, so you guys get an idea about my background and the work I've done. I've been working in digital imaging since around 1990, 91. Back in those days, there weren't resources like this for learning, so I spent a lot of time on the phone calling up everybody I could find to see who could share some information with me. And I got lucky enough to find a few people who would help me start to get a foothold, and took it from there. This is my website. Dunbar Digital is my website for that. You can reach me through here. If we bring up the rest of the page, you can see I have my portfolio here, a little bit about myself. I have some before afters. On my blog, I try to frequently update the blog with stories about current projects. I do a series of interviews for the clients of retouching. So this is called Insights on Retouching from the Client's Perspective. And I'm interviewing art producers, art buyers, high-end photographers, talking with them about what they look for in the way of retouching. Because part of the thought is, well, there's lots of resources for learning how to do Photoshop work and how to do retouching. The viewpoint that matters the most is what your clients are looking for, because it's our jobs to meet their expectations and what they're looking for. So you can find stuff in here on that. And then here's the contact page, so you can contact me. This way you can either send it to me using this, or my email is dennis@dunbardigital.com. To show you a little bit about the portfolio, I have, let's see, let's go to an individual one. One of the things people like a lot is the movie poster work I've done. So I've had the pleasure of working on a lot of movie posters over the years. what the way this works, the way the movie poster industry works, is the ad agencies have teams of art directors and designers who work on designing the posters, and it goes through round after round after round with the ad agency. And once the studio makes a pick and says that's the one, that's what we want, then they take it and they turn over the low-res layered comp to somebody like me called a finisher, and we take it through the final steps where we blow it up to the final size, replace everything with high-res elements, make sure everything looks perfect and clean. So that's kind of what this process is for these. These are a couple of older things for HBO. This was for the Blair Witch Project. I actually won a Key Art Award, so that was a lot of fun. And just different poster we worked on here. This was a lot of the characters from Marvel's Defenders series. So this is the head guy from Marvel in charge of the series, and then these are the actors who were playing all the stars on that. This one was a lot of fun because in this shot, the Nameless, one of the things that happens a lot when you're working on movie poster stuff is you get really poor quality originals sometimes. A lot of times lately you may get much better quality originals, but back 10, 12 years ago I was working for this place, Bemis Balkan, and we had some really poor quality originals for this. And when we're looking at this, I thought, this is about the shape of my daughter's face. So I took a shot of her in front of our home, brought it in and retouched this and stuff. So my daughter Katie is famous for being the nameless one in this poster for this. I also worked on a lot of Harry Potter posters. This was Star Trek. Each one of these was a mini poster. So each one was distributed separately at one of the conventions for this. Just a lot of fun working on these things. A lot of challenges to working on movie poster stuff, because if we look up here, like for this Jumanji one, the shot of her was really pretty decent. She needed a fair amount of retouching, but the background needed an extensive amount of work for this because we had to make sure the colors matched, make sure there was enough proper kind of texture going up into here, make sure the sky, all looked right. So lots of moving parts and things working on posters like this. For this one with Jack Black, the shot for him was a still shot from this on set, and it was really, really poor quality. His legs cut off about here, so we had to find some legs to extend him out. He really wasn't very sharp, so I had to play a lot of tricks to bring in some sharpness, bring in lines and texture into his beard, around his eyes and stuff. So just a lot of different challenges. The Rock on this one, he was like 3 or 4 parts. The motorcycle was 3 or 4 parts for this. So a lot of different moving parts and stuff you have to put together for movie poster stuff. I've also worked on a fair amount of car shots, beauty stuff. We're here today to talk about beauty retouching techniques. So this is some of the beauty shots I've worked on over the last few years. So it's a lot of fun working on shots of beautiful women. One of the things that's important to know as you move from genre to genre is the expectation level from the clients about what they're looking for is a bit different. For instance, on a movie poster, if we come back here, for movie posters, they're going to be looking for something different when it comes to the retouching quality on somebody's face. So for a shot like this, where it's basically a big headshot, they're going to be looking for a different level of retouching on here than if it were for something for the cover for a beauty magazine. So you have to understand what the client's looking for and the best ways to achieve that. The best thing I find about being well-versed in a variety of different genres is I can take techniques from one and apply them to another and help raise the bar on each of these. So the techniques I learned working on beauty retouching, working with skin and really making that look really good, I now apply to a lot of the entertainment stuff. And rather than using the faster, dirtier techniques that a lot of people were common to use it, I'm able to achieve a little bit higher end looking result really quickly and seamlessly for the movie poster stuff. I also work on a fair amount of product work. Product work is a lot of fun. So these are watches and smartphones or worked on for a photographer in the Bay Area, Hunter Freeman. These were product shots for Anthony Nex. These shots of the Nike shoes, these were quite the challenge. These ones here, like this one, this was a series of shots. We had something like 40 different shots, I think, we had to deliver for Nike. These were all shoes that were supposed to be made out of custom-made shoes out of Pendleton fabric. None of these shoes existed when they gave it to us. What the photographer did was he shot light gray shoes, which was the base model of the shoe, and then he draped fabric over the shoes and sent us shots where it's just the fabric draped over the shoe. And then our job was to make it look like the shoe was actually made with those fabrics and all that. So it was a lot of masking, a lot of figuring out how to recreate the lighting, a lot of color changing. This sole was originally white, had to turn the sole black. Did have a one where it was a black sole, we had to turn it white. That was a little more challenging. All of these pieces here stripped in and composited in. So these were some of the different models. This is on the same base of shoe. There were several different base shoes we did. With these, it was one kind of shoe, but all these different color schemes and things had to be applied to this.
So I've got a question, Dennis.
What?
I've got a question, Dennis. There was one on the shoe where you said you had to take it white and turn it black. What was your? Can you explain your basic process for that? Did you just photograph the black rubber and replace it, or did you do some type of a coloring technique?
It was a coloring technique, mostly using curves. So very careful, clean mask made just for the sole, and that allowed me to have a color corrections that affected just that. And then most of it was just working with a curves adjustment layer.
Oh.
I'd have to dig into that, and maybe another show we can talk about product retouching for that. But it was basically just using curves for that. Curves is my favorite color correction tool because it's so flexible and so powerful.
Okay.
Anyway, you can see the variety of different stuff. The thing for me is I love working on cool images, and so whether it's a really cool looking shot of some beauty products or 3D bottles, or if it's a beautiful shot of a woman, I just love working on cool looking images. And for me, Photoshop techniques are like a basic set of Lego blocks. We reconfigure the Lego blocks to work on different tasks and things. So from a basic set of Lego blocks, you can create all these wonderful sculptures and wonderful things. Photoshop's just the same way, using the same basic techniques: masking, color correction, different ways of playing around with the tonality and retouching things, and then you just apply them in different ways. So the way I work working on a image like this of smartwatches isn't that different from the way I work on movie posters or on shots of people for portraits. So that gives you a little bit of background to that. Somebody had commented they liked the before afters. So before afters are a lot of fun to show, but as a retoucher they're really difficult because there are two factors go in. One is I always ask permission before showing a before image or even an after image from the client. Your reputation and your working relationship with your clients is the most important aspect about this job. So you want to make sure you're maintaining that. So especially with entertainment work, I always wait and make sure that the client I worked for says, yes, it's okay to show that image now, because you never know, somebody at the studio might get upset, something's being shown somewhere or whatever. The last thing you want to do is be the guy that caused the problem, because you're not going to work for that client anymore. When you're showing stuff for something like this, where it's more of a commercial type thing, you also have to think about how does it present the photographer. There was a shot I did where there were some really people on a golf course, and did a lot of extensive work on it. And the photographer said, nobody's going to understand the lighting conditions we had. It was supposed to be late afternoon, clear, beautiful sky, and it was overcast, and they were dodging bits of rain and stuff as they were shooting. So nobody's going to understand the weather stuff I couldn't control. They're just going to see this like, oh, you guys not a very good photographer. So you have to be really careful as a retoucher when you're showing your work, how you present your clients. You don't want to make them look bad, so you want to show it off in a way that's going to compliment everybody. So that's why there aren't a whole lot of before afters on here. It's hard to get the permission for that, but it is fun when you get to show this. These were something where for photographer Bob Stevens, and it was an ad for Kaiser Permanente. So we're supposed to make composite different shoes together, so they look like a generic kind of shoe. They didn't want to have to worry about getting permission from whatever particular brand of shoes. So we made custom-made shoes, and then it was supposed to look like it was wrapped in plastic, as if it were a piece of produce or whatever like that, that had to be used by. The whole thing has this best if used by, and the whole campaign was to get you out and working and exercising and being active, because you're healthier if you're that way.
So this brings a whole new concept.
Different shoes together. Once we composited the shoes together, stripping them onto the foam plate, color correcting it, and then the hardest thing was illustrating the plastic wrap over that. And I did some experiments with shoes that I had. I just put them on a cookie tray and wrapped it in plastic, took a look at it, and realized the plastic wrap was mostly showing up as shadows and highlights. And so I was able to have them just photograph. Once they photographed all the shoes, they wrapped a pair of shoes in plastic. They actually spray painted them black, so it would show up better. And then they wrapped them in plastic and moved the lights around and got different glares and stuff around the wrinkles. It's kind of hard. Every time I go over here, it gets dark. So anyway, they photographed that, and then what I did was I used the pen tool to trace out different shapes, and from that I was able to create the highlights and shadows and things like that. So it kind of had the realistic looking shapes that you would get if it was really wrapped in plastic. I didn't have to imagine what they looked like. I had a model to go by. But that's what an awful lot of high-end Photoshop work is imagining what the end result would look like and then figuring out how you get it there. So with this one, using the shots they had of the shoes actually wrapped in plastic, I was able to imagine what those glares and highlights and stuff look like for these things. So anyway, this gives you a good idea about what I'm up to and all that. I also wanted to say, by way of resources, I have a Facebook group with Carrie Bean. She's a high-end retoucher from New York. She works mostly on high-end beauty, cosmetic ads, and things like that. And we started this group about a year ago, I guess. It's called Real Retouching Learn and Teach in Facebook. For that, we have 520 members so far. And we try to present different challenges and different questions, discuss different issues and things about Photoshop and retouching in general, with an idea of being supportive. Nobody's here to tear anybody down. We just want to help everybody learn. So this is like a latest challenge Carrie Bean has. Here's an old shot she had done from the film days, where this is the scan she got. And she said, okay, their challenge is to not only color correct it, but retouch it as if it's a high-end thing. So initially people are talking about different ways they're color correcting it, and then they're going to get into seeing who can do it the best job in the retouching work on it. It's a good place to learn. and hopefully it's a supportive community that people can get used to learning about. So let's get into the Photoshop stuff. One of the things, before we get into Photoshop, one of the things we want to do is talk a little bit about workflow. And the primary thing about workflow is how you set things up initially for this. So one of the things I hear a lot of people say they have problems with Photoshop is, with retouching, is you really need to use something like a Wacom tablet. It's really hard. I know only a couple people that retouch using a mouse. For me, it's like trying to paint with a brick in your hand. So the power of having a stylus in your hand, a pen in your hand, and all the fluidity you get for that is really important for this. But one of the things that people get mixed up on are the settings and how to make that more intuitive. So the first thing I wanted to show you is I work on a Macintosh, so the settings I use here are in the Mac, but I'm sure there's similar settings on a PC thing. First thing I do is when I go to sit down on a new machine is make sure I open up the Wacom preferences and I go to mapping and I tell it to force proportions. This means it's going to only use a portion of the tablet. It shows you here it's only using a portion of the tablet, but it's going to be proportional to the real estate you have on your screen. The cool advantage about that is when you draw a circle on your tablet, it will show up as a circle on your screen. If you have force proportions off and you draw a circle on your tablet, it's going to come off as an ellipse on your screen because it's not going to be a one-to-one relationship in terms of proportions. Same thing with if you draw a square or whatever like that. It's going to be, your brain's going to have to do a little more translation about that. So that's one thing I like to set up for this. When it comes to the functions, I use the Wacom Intuos Pro 5 for this. Almost everybody I know turns all these things off because, while a few people may find them really helpful, what happens is my hand keeps sliding over them, and all of a sudden I'm keying something in. It's a user interface I'm unfamiliar with. So we tend to turn all those things off for that. But the thing you have to remember is when you turn them off, sometimes you also have to go in and turn them off for application things as well. So you might set them all off here, and then you have to go over, and sometimes it pops up. You have to turn it off, go back into Photoshop here, and turn it off in Photoshop for this. And then along with the Wacom settings, I want to go over the Photoshop preferences. So I'm going to bring up, come on, preferences. There we go. Bring up the Photoshop preferences. The things I like to set up with these is I like to turn off export clipboard. These days I'm working on very large files. This one here you can see here. If you look down at the screen, this one's a lower res version that I use for demos. The machine will act faster. But you see it's already 200 megabytes as a open file. If I'm working on a movie poster, a few weeks ago I was working on something for a billboard that wound up being like 60 gigabytes as an open file. It was 500 megabytes as a flat file. So if I'm copying a 500 megabyte bit of information from Photoshop and pasting it into another image, I don't want to have to export that 500 megabyte clipboard every time I go to switch back to the desktop or wherever else, because that's a lot of extra work for the machine to do. So I always turn off export clipboard off. Interface, this is where you set your preferences for the interface, so that's all a personal thing. All these things are all pretty much default. History log, I used to use the history log. I thought it would be great to keep a track of the histories that are going in here with each image. But what I found was it was making the metadata of my files so big that when you use it in Quark Express or InDesign, sometimes it was choking the servers and stuff for that. This is under file handling. This is where you set it for your automatic save recovery thing. If Photoshop crashes, it'll have that. So You can set it to really often, but that's a lot of work for your machine to do. So I tend to set it to 15 minutes or even sometimes set it to an hour because if I'm working on a really big file, I need all the resources for Photoshop I can get. Performance, you set your amount of RAM here. The default thing seems to want about 75% of RAM, so I try to max that out to whatever this says. I have about 24 gigabytes of RAM on this machine. For that, you want to max out the amount of RAM you can have. That will always help speed up your machine. I also have a solid-state disk that I use, the scratch disk. It's just a small one. It's like 240 megabytes. 240 gigabytes is a scratch disk. It's dedicated just for that. So if we come over here to our scratch disk, come on. We have the spinning wheel now. Anyway, in the scratch disk settings, you can set your scratch disk for that, and you love getting this spinning beach ball of death when you're working on a demo because it's just the most exciting thing for everybody to see. Anyway, when you set your scratch disk thing, you have a solid state disk that's only working as your scratch disk as your primary thing. It definitely helps speed up your file. I did a test when I did it. I opened a 20 gigabyte. There we go. I opened it up a 20 gigabyte file and made a really huge brush and just scrolled straight across. And when I had the solid state disk set turned off as a scratch disk, I watched the brush go slowly making its way across the thing. When I turned this on and restarted Photoshop, and then went across it, it made a noticeable improvement in the speed. So this is a really great way to speed up your thing. The other thing I like to do is cursors. I like to show the normal size brush tip. I like to show crosshair of the brush tip. That is so when I'm lining something up, I get a little crosshair and I know right where the center of my brush is, so I can line things up a little bit easier between, like if I'm using a clone tool or the healing brush, I can line up the source and destination more accurately for that. I also like to have the cursor set more precise as opposed to standard because where the eyedropper is sort of somewhere around the tip of the eyedropper, but you're never quite sure where you're picking the sampling from. This way it makes it really easy. The center of that is what you're sampling from, so it makes it easy. So those are the basic things that I set up on here. The other thing I want to talk about is brushes. So if we go to brushes, you have these choices for brushes here. And one of the things you'll notice is a lot of the default brushes for Photoshop, when you're working with a Wacom tablet, let's bring up the brush settings here. You can see a little more accurately what's going on with this. So a brush like this, you can see the size is changing for this. So what happens a lot when people are working with a Wacom tablet or any sort of stylus thing, they say, it gets really confusing. Part of what happens is because your brushes are doing so many things based on the pressure and the sensitivity of your tablet. So when it's set for sheep dynamics, what this is doing is it's changing the size of your brush based on how heavy or light you're pressing on the stylus thing. And so a lot of people, when they're working on this, all of a sudden where they think they're going to have a large brush stroke, it becomes a little like a little pin scratch coming across. And they're like, wait a minute, what's going on? What happened to my nice big brush stroke? A lot of the brush things also have the transfer things set on to this. So as you're working on this, it's not only changing size, but it's also changing the density of your brush. And then that's an awful lot happening at the same time for that. So what I tend to advise people to do is turn off shape dynamics, turn on transfer, and set it for pen pressure. Now this way, when you brush something, when you make a brush stroke, it's only going to affect the opacity of your brush. A lighter touch. Let's make a new Photoshop document, and I'll show you real quick what I mean for this. So we're going to choose a nice red color. There we go. We got a nice red color here. And I'm going to change my brush. So with the way this goes, if I go just a little lightly on my brush, you see it's only a little bit of paint. If I go heavier, we get a much brighter amount of paint. I'm going to come back here, and I'm going to fill my background with white, so it's a little easier to, there we go. I'm going to make a new layer, just so it's easier for me to work with this. Okay, so this should be a little easier for you to see what's going on with this. Oh, I have my flow set down. Always double check that before you start to do your demo. Check the settings here. We're going to talk about that in just a moment. Okay, so you see here where I've got the light brush, and now it goes to the opaque color. Light brush and opaque color. All I'm varying is the amount of pressure I'm pushing on my stylus. So that's what this does. If we turn this off and we come over here to shape dynamics, and let's choose this one. We're going to delete this, make our brush a little bit larger. Now you see what happens is the size of the brush is changing based on the amount of pressure. So I find it's a lot more intuitive if I limit it to one or the other, not both at the same time for that. So my preference is I like to have this setting as my default thing for a brush for that, because changing the size, I see the size in the little preview here on the icon, and the opacity for this is just a much more natural way for me to look. I just want to paint a little bit of paint, light touch. A heavy thing gives me a much heavier brush. Gives me a much structure for that. So that's the other thing with setting up your brush things for that. While we're here, and we keep checking onto this, these brush settings here are something that you want to pay attention to. You have, let's delete this. Nope. I'm just going to play that off. Okay, so opacity is changing the opacity of each brush stroke. Let's turn off our transfer for the moment. Opacity is going to change the opacity of each brush stroke. So if I come back to here and set it down to something like 25%, no matter how hard I push, the maximum opacity of this brush stroke is going to be 25%. And then another 25% and another 25%, so on, building up little by little. That's what opacity does. If I set opacity to 100% and I set flow to about 25%, now as I go like this, it's going to be, now as I go like this, it builds up as I going back and forth. So flow is as you go back and forth, you're building up. Opacity is each stroke you're building up for that. If you have both set to a lower amount, what you're going to have happen is there we go. If we set both like to a lower amount, like this, then it's going to mean the maximum flow I can get is up to that amount, but I get even, I can build up to that maximum flow little by little. So I tend to use one or the other. Sometimes when burning and dodging, I will set opacity down to a little bit lower thing, but I tend to use flow more and more. And it's a practice thing. At first, flow didn't speak to me at all, but the more I use flow, the more it speaks to me and seems a natural way for me to be working for this. So I'm going to turn the transfer back on and get back to my regular brush. So we've covered the brush settings. We've covered the vacuum tablet settings. The other stuff, just by way of preliminary stuff to cover, are a very important thing are your color settings in Photoshop. This is where you're setting your color management policies for Photoshop, and it becomes really important because if you don't calibrate and profile your monitor properly, and you don't have your color settings set up in Photoshop to work with profiles properly, you're never really going to know what you're working with for this. So you want to make sure these are all set up right. This is the default setting. I recently had to reset the defaults on my Photoshop thing to get to resolve an issue or whatever like that. So this is what your default settings would look like in Photoshop. for this. sRGB is where you set your RGB is where you set your preferred color working space. I tend to prefer Adobe RGB for this as a freelance retoucher, working with a variety of clients. I'm not particularly married to any one color space for this, but the whole idea about the color space issue is there are three main ones being used by people these days. sRGB, which is color space meant to mimic the color gamut of what can be reproduced on a really inexpensive 13-inch cheap monitor from years ago. I think it was around like 1995, 96, somewhere around there. They figured out what the typical color gamut of the low-end monitor was, and that's what sRGB is. And then for a little while, color match was being used, but I don't see many people run into that now. Adobe RGB is the next one. So the color gamut for this is a little bit wider. You get more saturated color out of that, which is really nice for that. So I tend to like Adobe RGB for that. And then some photographers really like ProPhoto RGB. ProPhoto RGB has a really huge color gamut. The whole idea with this is to be a container for every possible color you could imagine. The problem with that, though, is it becomes such a huge color gamut that when you're working in Photoshop, like with a curve thing, you get steps from 0 to 55 to adjust a curve thing. The step in between each one becomes really huge and really noticeable. So you're more likely to run into issues with banding, where you're seeing the different steps and colors showing up and all that. So ProPhoto is a little more difficult color space to work with. So I find Adobe RGB to be the best compromise for that. But again, if a client tells me I want to work in ProPhoto, great, I'm going to work in ProPhoto. If I'm working at one of the movie poster agencies and say, yes, our default color space is sRGB, I'll work in that. CMYK, fortunately, we don't have to worry about that a whole lot these days. CMYK is a color space oriented for direct output. So it's very, very much print specific. Meaning, if you are sending to a given printer, the best thing to do is to call that printer up and say, what CMYK profile do you use for your press for that? Because well, in the US we have SWAP and we have Grackle and we have these different standards. Not every printer is following those standards 100%. So they're going to have some variation with that. So you want to make sure you're matching it to the print conditions that you expect things to be. Unfortunately, when you're the retoucher, you very rarely get much information about what those print conditions are going to be. And that means you have to make a wild guess about something. And the odds are pretty strong you're going to be a little bit off with that guess. So webcode and swap v2 is the default one that most people follow, but it's really not a default space in the way we think about it, because you can pretty much guarantee almost all the printing devices you're sending to are not following the swap color space for that. The other thing you want to set is color management policies. They should always be set to reserve embedded profiles, so that way it's if an image comes to you with a profile embedded in it, you know it's going to honor that and work with that. You're not going to be changing colors without realizing what's going on. If they turn them off, then you're never going to know when you're changing the colors, whatever. You'll never really know what that image was supposed to look like. You don't want to convert it to your working RGB, because then every time you open up an image from a client, you're going to convert it to whatever your working space is and not what the client wanted it to be in. When it comes to these warning dialogues, profile mismatches, I always like to I always like to set them so that all these dialogues are turned on, because I figure more information better. I want it to tell me when I'm opening something up and say, hey, this is an sRGB. Did you realize that? I'm like, oh, good point. Also, when I'm pasting from copying information from one image to another and there's a profile mismatch, I want it to alert me to that and give me a chance to make a choice about how to handle it. And then if there's no profile embedded with this, I want it to tell me when there's no profile embedded, so that I can make a choice. I'm like, oh, well, let's see, I downloaded this off of a stock site on the web, which means it's probably sRGB, because that tends to be the default RGB working space for the the web stuff, so I'll assign sRGB to it. Or like, oh, this came from my client who always loves to work in Pro Photo RGB. I'm guessing it's going to be Pro Photo RGB, and I can assign the right profile to it and start from a better working space for that. Let's see. We talked about stuff. Oh, the other tools. We talked about brushes. The other tools that I use a lot are the healing brush, spot healing brush, and the healing brush. The things to be aware of for the spot healing brush is you have these options up here. So these are the ways, these three things here are going to set the way that the spot healing brush is working with the information below that you're working on. Content aware is going to try to preserve the borders between really strong contrasting colors or tones, like light and dark. It will tend to give you a better result when you're crossing over the border of something like this. But it doesn't tend to do a really great job when it comes to preserving the texture, like skin or whatever. Great texture is something I almost never use because it seems to be a really unpredictable thing for me. But proximity match is the other option that I use. And what that will do is proximity match. Let's come in here and let's set up a new image, a new thing. We're going to call it demo retouch.
Now, Naomi just made a comment that you're going a little too fast, but I want to make a comment to Naomi. So, Naomi, this is not a hands-on experience. Just to communicate. So this is being recorded. So if you're trying to follow along, that's this particular presentation wasn't designed to follow along. So, and also just so that you're aware that she made a comment.
Yes,
okay.
It's a hands-on presentation.
Right.
But since Stephen told me most of this group is fairly advanced, I wanted to cover the basic stuff and not get too bogged down into the basics. That's because I can get really off into the weeds on that. So that's why I was trying to go a little quick for that. Seth is asking if my color settings in North American Pre-Press 2, that's the default setting. And I had just reset I just had to reset the preferences for my Photoshop thing. So I had not set these up the way I like them yet. So when I change this to Adobe RGB, it comes up and says custom. There are a number of different options you can go with here, and I have to go back and look through them to see which one's which, because it's been quite a while since I've used this. But my understanding is, looks like North American Pre-Press 2. Looks like that is the same kind of options, I guess. So Seth, I suppose that would be correct. I just never remember what this setting is. I just know what I set them here. So I tend to forget what these particular ones are. Does that answer your question, Seth? Back to the thing about the healing brush. The spot healing brush is my favorite retouching tool to begin with. So the thing I was talking about is the way these go. I'm going to give you a little demonstration of that. The next thing to do is click on Sample All Layers. Because if you notice here, I just made this layer called Demo Retouch. So I made a new layer. There's nothing in this layer. It's what we call an empty layer. If I'm going to use any sort of a retouching tool, I need to turn on something where it's going to sample the layers below it. Because if there's nothing in this layer, and this is turned off, nothing will happen. So if we turn this off, I'm coming back in here and going over this, nothing happens because there is nothing in this layer to sample. If I unclip this and we turn just this on, you see there's nothing in that layer. So brushing around, there's nothing in there for it to sample. But if I turn Sample All Layers on, now there is something for it to sample, and it's going to start giving me a result. For some reason, it's not giving me much of a result in here. There we go. Okay, so create. I think what's going on here is, yes, I had on proximity match, and proximity match, for some reason over here, it wasn't matching up really well. If we come over here, this is interesting. I've not seen proximity match not work on this kind of thing before. So I figure first time you're doing a demo, that's going to be the thing that doesn't work the normal way. But content aware is the default one that I go to most of the time. And I like content aware because if I cross over a border like this, it tends to give me a pretty good result. If I turn on proximity match, now you see it gives me a kind of a funky looking result here. Another good place to see that is here with the eye. Now, proximity match is not doing anything here. Normally what happens is, yeah, you get this really squiggly kind of smeary look result. If I turn on content aware and I come over here, it tends to do a better job of honoring those borders. See, so I was able to retouch out that eyelash, but the rest of the borders here, it honored those borders really pretty well. So content aware is a really great tool to use when you're crossing over different things. But if we come over here and we work on this, sometimes it doesn't do such a great job of keeping the texture. So you see a little bit of texture here, and then here it gets a little smoother. This is where you want to be watchful. The biggest key for anything you're doing in Photoshop is to know what to watch out for. Every tool, every technique has its strengths and its weaknesses. And the more you know about what the strengths and the weaknesses are, you know what to be watching for. Training your eye is the biggest thing you can do till you get better at anything you're doing in Photoshop or photography or whatever like that. So knowing what to look for and knowing when to be cognizant of, like, okay, here the results all look pretty good. Over here the texture got lost a little bit. Is that going to be a problem? Well, perhaps that could be a problem over here. So I might have to do something about that. But where I'm working over here, is this going to be a problem for this? Like, no, that's actually giving me a pretty good result. So as I'm working, I'm watching and seeing what the results are for this. And you'll notice that I'm working on removing the stray hair that I may have to go back and over it a couple of times. One of the things that I see happen when a photographer friend sent me something to work on. He said, oh, my usual retouch to work on this. Can you just knock out the background for me and strip it against something else? I looked at it, and I saw there were little bits of stray hairs and stuff left there because the retoucher wasn't watching to make sure that she was being thorough and catching all these little bits for that. So you wind up with little stray bits and stuff stuck around, and it becomes harder to get a good result. So what I do is when content aware is not doing a great job with the texture as it did over here, that's when I'll come over to proximity match and see if proximity match does a better job for that. So most of the time, between those two options, it will work out really pretty well. If these things are not working out really great for me, then I switch over here to the healing brush. Now the healing brush, we have the mode I usually set to normal. Sampled is going to be sampling from whatever it is you have in your image that you're asking it to sample, as opposed to using some kind of a pattern or some sort of thing like that. So I almost never use the pattern. I'm going to use sampled. For this, aligned means when you set your source point and you go there, you see the crosshair and your brush thing. That relationship is going to maintain wherever you go for this. If you turn off align and you set the brush source down here, and you come over here, it's always going to be going back to that original brush source for that. So I tend to leave aligned on, so I want to set the relationship, and I can follow along and have that be predictable. On occasion, I will turn this off if I want to build out from one particular area and just keep building it out and building it out. The other thing you want to notice is over here, we weren't getting a whole lot of result. That's because this is set for current layer. I want to set this to current and below. Now you notice with the spot healing tool, we had current layer or all layers. With the regular healing tool, we have current and below. This is really important because over here we have all these other adjustments. So if we turn these adjustment layers on, that I have current and below on, I can work here and get a predictable result. It's not going to double up with the color correction layers things are that are on top. If I come to my spot healing tool and I have sample all layers on, Now what it's going to do is it's going to be reading. Let's turn this back to kind of where. Now what it's going to be doing is it's going to be reading. Oh, great! It's not showing me the great example now. It's going to be reading all these. So let's do something really wacky with this. Let's really play the color up. Actually, let's not play that. Let's make our color something really strongly saturated and really whack the color out. So now what's going to happen is we come over here and we're on our demo retouch thing. What should happen is, oh great. Again in the demo, it's not working the predictable way. What happens with sample layers is usually it's sampling what these things are and returning that result underneath. So wherever you go, wherever you're using that brush, it's doubling up on whatever you have above that. But we're not getting that result this time, so it's making a fool of me for this. So that's what Photoshop is best about doing, isn't it? It's best at making us look kind of silly. Anyway, so those are the settings for the healing tool, spot healing tool, and the The next thing I do is the rubber stamp tool. Again, it's just a matter of setting this thing to current and below, so it's not going to double up with these things. And you also have your brush settings here for this. So you want to make sure that your brush is set for that. We bring up brush settings. I don't want to adjust this. Come on. Brush settings. There we go. So I want to make sure that this tool also is using the brush settings I used there for that. Every now and then when you set your preferences back to default, it defaults back to those things for that. Okay, so we've gone over those basic things for this. Oh yeah, the spot, the clone stamp tool. Set this to current and below. Aligned is the same basic idea. Let's make a demo retouch. And now when we go, it's going to have that sort of thing. Here you see the difficulty with the clone stamp tool is copying the exact pixels from here and depositing there. So over here where the tonality and color and texture is similar, it works. Up here where the forehead, the color and the light is changing, I'm going from here, it leaves an obvious artifact for that. That's why I like to start off with the simplest thing. Spot healing is really pretty simple. So I start off with that, and I don't have to worry about matching color and tonality and all that. It does a good job of calculating that. If that's not working, I move to the healing brush, and I can work on building up the texture there. I just have to think more about where I'm sampling from, because sometimes I'm sampling texture from one place and depositing it in a place that doesn't really match up well. And then if those things don't work, I really got to go to it. I'll go to the clone stamp tool. My final fallback thing for retouching would be the brush tool, where you get in and actually have to go in and paint. So sometimes you have to paint out these things. Sometimes if there's a lot of stuff over the eyeball, you have to go in and manually paint out parts of it. That can be a lot of work, so I tend to go with the simplest approach first for that. But those are the basics on the tool things for that. I wanted to get that out of the way so people understood the basis for what we're working with on there. One last thing with the tools I wanted to remember was when we go back to the brush tool, there are a couple of buttons here that show up that we want to pay attention to here for this. This one here is going to we want to have this turned off, because this one, if it's turned on, it always uses pressure for opacity. So no matter what your opacity is set here, it's going to override that, and it's going to always use pressure for opacity. Since we're using that, we're setting our opacity here and we're setting our flow here, And we also had the transfer functions set for that. This is just overriding a lot of the controls we set. So we want to turn that off. This is the airbrush button. If you turn this on and you hit a number on your keypad, it changes the flow just by that. So if I hit 5, my flow will be 50%. If I hit 9, my flow will be 90%. If I turn this off and I hit a number, it's changing the opacity. So since I like to use keyboard shortcuts wherever possible to speed myself up, and I tend to favor flow more and more for that as I get used to it, I like to leave this turned on so when I'm hitting a button, I know I'm setting my flow setting for that. The other thing you want to watch out for is this button. You want to make sure this button is turned off because this one will say always use pressure for size. So this button and this button are two things that override the settings you've set in these things and in your brush itself. So this one is use pressure for size. This one is use pressure for opacity. And I have both of those turned off. So the only thing I'll turn on is this. But you want to make sure that when you're going with your brush settings, I think the same thing applies in the clone stamp tool. Yeah, we have the same things here for the clone stamp tool. For that, for clone stamp, I'm still old-fashioned in that I use the keyboard settings for opacity. For that, I don't tend to use flow that much with clone stamp. But again, it's just a particular way I work. I find my workflow, my preferences for which I use one over the other tends to change as time goes on. And I think that's a good thing because it's showing I'm always experimenting, trying something else for that. So, so that's the last of those things. Let's get into taking a look at typical workflow for retouching for this. I'm going to throw out that layer. And this is an image. We're in the final stages for working on a book with Katrine Eisman, a book called Photoshop Restoration and Retouching. If we come back over here, come on. Come back over here. We have Photoshop Restoration and Retouching. The third edition is out now. The one we're working on will be the 4th edition. This is the one. So this it's funny. I used one was available, but the book hasn't been released yet. It's supposed to be coming out this summer. So Photoshop Restoration Retouching 4th edition. Look for that book coming this summer for that. But this is one of the images I used in the demo. I wrote 3 chapters in that book. Portrait retouching, beauty retouching, and then one where we lump food, architecture, and product retouching on the same thing. So this is one of the ones for the product retouching. The portrait retouching. But it shows my usual workflow for working on these things. And I find when you're working on anything in Photoshop, having a standardized workflow is really, really important because it means you're working in a flexible manner. You can go back and change what you need to change easily. And it also, you can come back to it several months later and everything makes sense. You can go back and look like, okay, I know what that layer is for. So the first thing you want to do is always name your layers. So you look here and you see I have a layer named Retouch. I have a layer named Stray Hairs, Under Eyes. Coming back several months after working on this image, or even a couple years after working on this image, I know exactly what this is. This is for getting rid of those stray hairs. So I don't have to guess about this. This one will be for working on underneath the eyes and all that. So it becomes easy to come back and do that. So my usual workflow is to first take a look at the image, and sometimes I do it just mentally, where I'm making note of what it is I want to retouch. Sometimes I'll go in and actually make notes myself. Sometimes the client sends me a marked up layer, like, hey, these things are what I want done. I just did something where some product shots of these bottles, and the photographer sent me the high-res shot, but he also had a markup layer on top saying, here, I want these layers gone, these lines gone, I want this stuff cleaned up here, whatever. It makes it easier to communicate. By making a markup layer for yourself, especially when you're starting out, it just serves as a good reminder about what it is you're paying attention to. So you don't come back like, okay, oh Lord, how could I have forgotten I wanted to remove this hair? Or how could I have forgotten I wanted to take care of these things here for that? So you don't have to make a markup layer, but sometimes it helps to just get in and look through the image and kind of have that Zen moment with it where you're thinking about what's distracting, what you want to take care of, and how you want to work on this. So after that, my first layer will be, I'll make a new layer, and I call it retouch. So here we're going to make that demo retouch again. And then I'm going to zoom in, and first I'm going to zoom in about 100%, and my first pass through, I'm going to go to my healing brush, which is J on the keyboard, spot healing brush, and I look at the background. I'm most carefully looking at the background and making a note in the background and any spots, whatever, like that. One of the things that I'm noticing more and more with digital images is backgrounds like this where things look like they're really pretty clean, or if you're shooting something with clear blue sky, or you shot somebody in a studio and they're seamless in the background, there's some smudge or something. Maybe it's a speck of dust on your camera sensor that you don't notice. So what I'll do is a lot of times I'll make a layer. I'm going to come up here and do it up here. I'm going to make a curves adjustment layer here, not exposure. I'm going to make a curves adjustment layer. I love curves. I use curves all the time. A friend of mine, Lisa Carney, uses levels. She says Lisa loves levels. Well, Dennis loves curves isn't quite the same alliteration, but we go for that. So I'm going to make something called solarization curves. And with these curves, a lot of times you can have curves that just exaggerate something just for help for preview. So if you line it up really clean, you can see any dark specks coming out. If you darken it a lot, sometimes you see the dark specks. For this, you can increase your contrast really strongly to try to see. What you're trying to do is exaggerate the preview so you can see whatever problems there might be hiding in the background. One of the coolest ways of doing that is to use something called solarization curves. Solarization curves are basically curves like this, where you have, this one has 3 up and 3 down. Some people set more. I find the number of up and downs doesn't matter a whole lot. What you're doing is you're just radically exaggerating the view of the image so you can see if there's anything in that background here for this. The way you make that, let's reset this. The way you make it is you just pull up, instead of pointing up here, you pull down, instead of pointing here, pull up, instead of pointing here. You just exaggerate it like this. And then after I do that, I just kind of fine tune it. I just kind of try to fine tune my points so that they're setting a little cleaner like that. But that's basically all that you're doing is this. It just takes a few moments to set this up, but it's kind of a bother to get it set up really like the way you love to have it set up for that. So that's why after I get these things set up, then I come over here and I click Save Curves Preset, and that's how I set this preset for that. Now this background here looks really pretty clean, but I find a lot of times with skies and seamless backgrounds or something where you think it's really pretty much a clean white background, this will show little hints and specks and stuff like that in the background that you weren't aware of for that. So that's one trick is to just have something that exaggerates your background for that. If you are using something like that, then obviously when you go to retouch, the spot healing tool with sample all layers isn't going to work. It's not supposed to work. So that's when you have to go to brush, healing brush tool, and make sure you set for current, below, not all layers. And that way you can go through and clean up things that way. But for this thing, the background looks pretty good for that. So we're going to come back to our default working space, go back to our spot healing tool, and the background looks pretty good. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit closer. This is all a matter of what's comfortable to you to see the level of detail you want to see. I'm going to take the spot healing tool. I'm just going to go over all the stuff that looks like it absolutely should go. For that, in here, these things got to be kind of time consuming. So if we have time, we can come back to how we deal with these things. for that. Sometimes it works pretty easily. Like there, that worked pretty well. And then other times when you're cleaning it out, you find that you have to go back in and rebuild a lot of striations and things like that. So I don't pay attention to these a whole lot in this stage, or unless it's something that really bothers me a whole lot. See over here, we're not quite getting the right kind of result for that. So that's where I would get, stop trying to clean that up, make that perfect. I might try to see what's going on here. The strategy with this is to make sure your brush size is just a little bit larger than the area you want to work on. You don't want the brush size to be really big, because that's going to cover such a broad area and you're going to wind up messing up stuff you don't want to touch. And if it's too small, then you're like going back and forth a million times. So you want to change your brush size so you get it just about the right thing. By the way, while I'm doing this, it's occurring to me that you guys might not realize what I'm doing to change the brush size. On a Macintosh, I'm not that PC literate, so I don't know the keys for the PC for this. But on the Macintosh, if I hold down the Control and Option keys and slide my cursor left or right, it makes the brush bigger or smaller. If I move my cursor up or down, it makes the brush harder or softer. This is one of the easiest ways to set, especially if you're going for something really big, something really small. It's one of the easiest ways to adjust it. The other way a lot of people do is the bracket keys. So if I tap on the right bracket, it makes the brush larger. If I tap on the left bracket, it makes the brush smaller. When I'm trying to be really, really precise, like if I'm doing dodging and burning, I tend to use the bracket keys because I'm going from this to this a lot. For just about everything else, I'm using the Control Option and sliding to adjust that way. So we're going to just continue working through the image here, letting Photoshop work, and again, we're watching to see, to make sure that it's getting all the stuff, we're not getting left with any stray bits of result over there. The thing I'm also looking for is the texture here looks really like it's keeping with the regular skin texture pretty good, matching that up pretty well. So I'm not that worried about all that skin texture there. I would work my way all the way through here, going bit by bit, cleaning these things up. This is something sort of thing that can take a little bit of time. So I'm not going to go over the whole image this way. I want to show you the way that sort of stuff works. And it's just going through and working my way through here, hitting all the things that look like they're really obvious problems that have got to go for this. So she's got a number of issues here. As I'm working on here, I'm debating whether or not I'm going to work with this with burning and dodging or clone stamp or whatever technique. For now, the spot healing brush is working pretty well. Over here, I'm noticing the texture was lost a little bit. So this is where I would switch to healing brush. And I have this set for aligned. So I'm going to figure this should be matching the texture right around here. So I'm going to source from here, come back in. And now you see in this area here, it's matching that texture a little bit better and getting a little bit better result. If I take it here and I come over here, it's going to tend to give me the wrong kind of texture. You see this texture it's coming from here and doesn't match up with this. This is where I have to resample, and it's got to be texture that belongs in that kind of area, looking like it fits there. That's why I tend to like the spot healing tool better, because with the spot healing tool, I can just brush in these areas here. I'm not worried. It will tend to do a pretty good job of matching that texture. Proper proximity match tends to do a pretty good job, but today it's kind of funky. It's not always giving me the results I'm expecting here for this proximity match. So I'll see what's going on with that. But content aware is my default go-to for this. So in an area like this, I'm going to switch back over to the spot healing, the regular healing brush. And we're going to come over here and work on these things. This is the way I work my way through. And a lot of times I start off with the brush and switch to like, yeah, it's working fine. I'm just going to stay with this brush. So I'm not really married to any particular one technique is superior over the other. The important thing is being observant about the results you're getting. And knowing, like we noticed here when using the spot healing tool, it wasn't matching the texture right. So let's fix that. Let's go to a technique that will match the texture right. And then other spots where I'm working on something, I don't need to do that. I can go back to my default thing and come back in here and get good results like this. So I'm always just watchful for this. The other thing I realized I forgot to talk about was keyboard shortcuts. Keyboard shortcuts is a really fast way for speeding up what you're doing. You can customize them. You can save your keyboard shortcuts. You can export them and put them in a Dropbox folder, so wherever you go, you can download your keyboard shortcuts and reuse them. So I do that all the time. You have keyboard shortcuts for application menus and for tools. So for like tools, I set my keyboard shortcut for the healing brush. The default thing would be spot healing brush tool, patch tool, and content aware move tool, all having J as the keyboard shortcut. I turn those off on patch tool and content aware because I almost never use those. In this way, I can hit J on my keyboard and go to the spot healing brush or the healing brush, and then I can hit Shift J and switch between one or the other. So it gives me a fast way to switch between tools. When I'm using the burn and dodge tools, I have the same thing. Burn and dodge tool, you would 0 or O, letter O would be default for dodge tool, burn tool, and sponge tool. I almost never use the sponge tool, so I turn that off. So I can pop back and forth between burn and dodge tool by hitting O, Shift O, O, Shift O, Shift O, Shift O. So it makes it really easy. So I went and customized all these according to the tools I use the most. And I also have a few things that I've set up for things like I duplicate layers a lot. So I have a shortcut for duplicating layers and all that. So this is a fast way to speed up what you're doing for that. There's 1,000 ways to work with in Photoshop. Actions and keyboard shortcuts are a great way to speed up what you're doing, and you can set those up entirely the way you want them to be. So we're back on our spot healing tool. I'm coming here and going through this. So I would just work my way all the way through this thing and work on getting this the way we want. And this is what my actual retouch layer wound up looking like. So just getting all these things taken care of for that. The next step I would do is, what's the next problem I want to tackle? Stray hairs. Well, stray hairs can be a bit of a problem. It can be a lot of work, especially with a blurry background like this. So if I did these on the same layer, I'm thinking if I have to go back and erase it, if I had done retouching on this part of the hair, for this, got something out, like if on my retouch layer, I had gotten rid of that little spot there, and then I wanted to clean this one off. Like, okay, I do that and don't get a result I like. I got to go back and redo this one. I don't want to accidentally do that, erase this part. So that's why I'll make a new layer for this, just so it gives me something easy to control this. And this is done the same kind of way. It's in these areas here, it's kind of a throw every tool you can think of at it. I meant to say demo stray hairs. Okay, I am a horrible typist, so please forgive the typing mistakes. There we go. So for this, let's try our spot healing tool. Let's see. Is that going to work for spot healing tool? Kinda, sorta. We still get some results over here. That's a match. Let's try a couple times. Let's go to our healing brush. Now you see, instead of having to go over here and select it, I hit Shift J, and I'm switching between. You see the brush size has changed. So that's telling me that I'm switching from one brush to the other. So we're on the regular healing brush. We'll come over here and try to match this up. These kind of blurry, blobby things can be the hardest to match up because you got to try to match the character of that blurry, blobby area. So it's sort of a combination of, here we were having success with the spot healing tool and the healing tool. Sometimes you go to the brush tool. B for brush. I'm going to set my flow down to something kind of lower so I can sneak up on what I'm doing. I'm going to sample the color here and try brushing in something like that. So it's a combination of these tools here to kind of work that in. With the blurry, blobby kind of backgrounds, what you want to be able to do is zoom out, and if you turn this on and off, you don't want to see that your blurry, blobby thing is suddenly looks out of place. So that's just a matter of working over all these areas here, going step by step. The next thing I'm going to do is I tend to work from top to bottom. So this young lady doesn't have much lines on her forehead. If it's somebody older, particularly like an older gentleman or maybe a middle-aged woman with lines in the forehead, you want to soften. I'll start off with lines in the forehead, then I'll move to lines around the eyes, and move to lines around the mouth. Each one of these will be set up on a separate layer for this, and the whole idea is to give me the power to adjust each one independently. What I mean by that is here we have something lightening the lines underneath her eyes. This one is set to 40% opacity. If we set this up to 100% opacity, I pretty much completely retouched out the lines underneath her eyes. But that doesn't look really natural. So I can come back and get a more natural result by sliding the opacity of this down to something that looks like it's about the right level of taste, that between the client and I, we agree is about the right amount. In this case, it might have been around 40%. Part of the reason why I work this way is since I'm not the final decision maker, my clients are, the more adjustability I build into my files, the easier it is for me to go back and tweak this out. So if I come here and say, I thought, okay, maybe 20% opacity on this was about what I thought looked right. The client said, oh, can you back off here? Can you take a little more of the lines on her eyes? Like, okay, there's 60%. Like, okay, that's a little too much. Let's go to 4%. Yeah, that looks just right. So I'm able to adjust this really quickly and easily. The way I work on that is demo under eyes, typed it right, woohoo! And then I'll zoom in, and an awful lot of this, again, depends on the character of what I'm working on. But I tend to start off with the spot healing tool, and small brushes here will give me a better kind of result, where I start off trying to get rid of the darkest lines. And then after I'm satisfied I've gotten with that, I'll tend to go to the healing brush tool and then try to work my way up with this. The thing you have to watch out for is sometimes with the healing brush tool, you'll start to get a dark, smeary kind of color shift. Like over here, it's a little bit not the right color. It's a little gray or bluer in here than it is over here. That may or may not be a problem for this. It depends a lot on how much we're going to lower the opacity for this. If we lower the opacity a whole lot, it may not matter much. So let's just keep that in the back of our mind and wonder how that's going to go. So now if we turn the opacity of this down to 40%, okay, that's not really bugging me that much at 40%. That's not really bugging me that much, so maybe we get away with it. If we are bothered by it, then we set it back to 100%. And then maybe we come over here and like, okay, I want to fix that issue that I saw here where the color is a little bit different. So that might be where I go to the clone stamp tool. I'm going to stamp some of the stuff there. I got to be careful not to stamp more eyelash in there. And I want to try to carefully pick the right stuff. And this is why you see the problem with the clone stamp tools. I keep accidentally sampling the wrong stuff for that. So you have to be really careful with that. I know Carrie likes to use lighten and darken modes for the clone stamp tool. For me, I've not found that really intuitive. It might be something I experiment more with and see how comfortable I get with that. But for myself, I tend to just leave this set for normal. So anyway, once you've got this set up right, and you've changed, you get the opacity dialed in for what you like, then you can move on to the next thing. The next thing for this would be a separate layer for cleaning up the eyes. This is done the same way as everything else. Spot healing tool, sometimes the brush tool, where there's a stray hair going over the eye, you have to retouch this out. This one was pretty simple. Demo, clean up eyes. And start off with my favorite spot healing tool. Let's work with that. So that's doing a pretty good job. We're just cleaning the veins in the eyes up. There should be a little bit of variation in the eyeball where you see eyeballs where it's perfectly smooth white. It tends to not look very human. It tends to look like a glass eye. And one of the things that we're really, really keyed into as human beings is what looks human. We are, from the very first moment of birth, we are programmed to recognize faces and eyes and all that stuff. So anything that doesn't look natural really hits, speaks out to us really quickly for that. So I tend to not go too overboard with cleaning up eyes. Just get enough out of the eyes so that it looks like it's a well-rested person.
Okay, Dennis, we're at 12:30 now, so how about if we take a 15-minute break? Is that okay?
Yeah, we can do that. Then I'll get a little bit on what I do with the color correction and finish this up, and then we can get into some other stuff. And we'll move through some other things a little more. But this is the basic workflow.
All right. So everybody.
Yeah. For the eyes and then my overall color correction.
Okay. So
on that. But yeah, let's take a break.
All right.
Back in 15 minutes.
Fantastic. Great job. Yay. Great. So, all right. I'm going to put the 15-minute break sign up now so it gives you guys a clear indication as when we're coming back. So as soon as that is up to 0, we are back on promptly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop the recording and then we're going to start a new one after this.